We should see al-Qaeda trying to get back in Egypt, trying to get back in Libya, and certainly redoubling efforts.
This is At Brookings, a weekly in-depth look at issues behind the news. This week, Middle East revolts. A threat to al-Qaeda?
Chaos and uncertainty are the byproducts of most revolutions. And as revolts sweep through the Middle East and North Africa, there's the al-Qaeda question. With so many variables at play, conditions could be ripe for jihadists to attempt takeovers in troubled nations. So what will al-Qaeda do? If the future mirrors the past, says senior fellow Daniel Byman, al-Qaeda could make a move. There's obviously a relationship between al-Qaeda, the jihadist movement, and the Middle East and North African states. If you could explain that for me, please.
It sees countries like Mubarak's Egypt as pro-American voices, and that right there is anathema. But the other is that they see them as dictatorships that have turned away from Islam. So whether it's Mubarak's military government that has a somewhat secular outlook, whether it's Gaddafi's, let's say unusual to put it charitably, interpretation of Islam along with socialism, these are seen as deviations from the faith. And that in many ways is much worse than their alliance with the United States. In fact, they would even say they've turned away from Islam, and as a result, they ally with the United States. So from al-Qaeda's point of view, the two go together.
Members of al-Qaeda have said publicly that they would take up arms with the Libyan rebels against Gaddafi. If this were to happen, would it exacerbate the situation there?
Certainly al-Qaeda opposes Gaddafi, and some of the strongholds that are opposition strongholds are also had been strongholds in the past for Islamists opposed to the Gaddafi regime. So certainly there's potential there. And from an opposition point of view, if they feel they're not getting the aid they need, they'll take aid from the jihadists. They'll take aid from anyone who will help them. And this is something that al-Qaeda wants to exploit. What they've done in the past is they've taken local civil wars, whether it's Chechnya or Iraq or elsewhere, that began really for their own national reasons, and tried over time successfully to subvert them to a more jihadist orientation. This is something that as the United States and its allies intervene, they need to really guard against.
Egypt was one of the first countries to experience this wave of revolutions we're seeing now in the Middle East and North Africa. It's a country in transition. Does this create an opportunity for the jihadist movement there?
These transitions are so tentative, are so uncertain, that demagogues can take advantage of them, that some of the forces that might be more destructive might be better organized at this point, that because the government is weak, individuals or groups can use violence to intimidate others. And there's a particular concern about al-Qaeda and the jihadists because Egypt was in many ways the intellectual home of this organization. So many cadre of al-Qaeda came from Egypt or have ties to the Egyptians. And we've seen in recent weeks a tremendous weakening of the state security apparatus. And that weakening is, of course, important for democracy. The security apparatus that fought al-Qaeda was also the one that put peaceful dissidents in jail. But by freeing up the country, you're also giving opportunities for al-Qaeda to move back in.
Yemen, as we all know, is ripe for a regime change. It's also a stronghold for al-Qaeda. If there is a revolt there, then what happens to the jihadist movement? Is it strengthened by a revolt against the current government?
Yemen today, as we speak, appears near the breaking point. We've seen today a key military leader turn away from the President Ali Abdullah Saleh. We've also seen additional key tribal figures turn away from the president. What makes Yemen even more weak, I guess you should say, is that it was suffering from several civil conflicts before all this began. So this was a weak government to begin with that is being pushed very hard by a range of forces. Part of the problem is it's very unclear what would succeed the current government. Would it be that the various rebellions would become stronger? Would a new, more legitimate government come in, perhaps? But certainly weakness is the likely result, at least in the short and medium term. And that's what al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, which is based in Yemen, is going to exploit. They've already pushed hard to take advantage of the weakness of the current Lebanese government, and they'll push even harder against any successor government.
The U.S. foreign policy plate is full with a war in Afghanistan, with a situation in Iraq, and now with the no-fly zone and bombing Libya. Can the U.S. afford to go down this road?
Much of what is counterterrorism is done in a very quiet way, involving intelligence cooperation and other forms of assistance and relations that aren't necessarily extremely manpower intensive, but involve a lot of coordination. So that can certainly continue. But part of the problem is that governments like Egypt, Yemen, Libya, they're all focused on other things right now. So counterterrorism is not going to be a priority for any of these, even if they share our concerns. So I think there'll be less attention to this in the Arab world. However, the wars in Afghanistan, the conflict in Iraq, these are going to continue. So I think many of the parameters are going to be the same, but some of the cooperation will be more limited.
The focus very often seems to be on how the jihadist movement could be strengthened by these revolutions, but there is another side of that argument where they don't necessarily bode well for the jihadist movement either.
These revolutions are also a risk for Al-Qaeda. These are very dramatic events, and Al-Qaeda had nothing to do with them. You had change come to a region, change Al-Qaeda has long called for, but again, Al-Qaeda was there on the sidelines. The change in Egypt seems to be democratic, which is not something Al-Qaeda supports. And this highlights a rather nasty side of the organization for many people in the region, that not only are they anti-dictator, but they're also anti-democracy. So the hope is that Al-Qaeda's worldview, that its image is going to be disgraced, embarrassed, and that the group will be less popular, even though their ability to operate, to communicate, to proselytize, to raise money, all of that is going to increase in the short term as these governments try to get their own security apparatus back in order and as they ease restrictions on these activities. So you're going to see a trade-off in terms of Al-Qaeda's big picture effectiveness and in terms of its day-to-day operational actions.
Stay up to date with the latest research, learn about Brookings events, and search our directory of experts, all from your mobile device. To download Brookings for your BlackBerry, Android, or iPhone, go to brookings.edu/mobile.